Hello, and welcome to History Soundbites, a podcast in which historians present their current research and leave us all feeling smarter and more informed for their efforts. Today's podcast features Katherine Perrotta, an adjunct instructor of history at Southern New Hampshire University and part-time assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, Georgia. Her presentation, 19th Century Rosa Parks, the legacy of antebellum civil rights activist Elizabeth Jennings. Sit back and enjoy.
My name is Katherine Perrotta, and I am an online history instructor for Southern New Hampshire University, teaching History 100, History 200, History 245, and the survey courses History 113 and 114. And I'm also a part-time assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. Today I'm here to share with you my research on Antebellum civil rights activist Elizabeth Jennings from New York City. Much of my research interests include how race is depicted in historical narratives and the subsequent history and social studies curriculum. And I discovered the story of Elizabeth Jennings about 10 years ago when I was teaching social studies as a classroom teacher in the New York City Department of Education. And I was on my way home from a professional development workshop at the Museum of the City of New York. And I was reading this book about tenements on the Lower East Side. I was sitting on a bus getting home that evening, and I came across this little caption that stated to the effect about a milestone of racial progress in New York City in 1854 due to the actions of a lady named Elizabeth Jennings. And I had never heard of her before. So I started doing some digging and some research, and although the primary source documents have been limited, enough is available where I've been able to construct a pretty decent narrative of not only her life as a civil rights activist in 19th century New York City, but to further highlight how issues of racial segregation in the antebellum North were quite the norm in the years preceding the Civil War, which doesn't really tend to be highlighted much in our U.S. history narratives when we study topics like race and civil rights with regard to the Civil War and, again, subsequent issues of segregation in our history. So over time, I was able to find several documents, newspaper articles by the New York Daily Tribune, the New York Times, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and the Frederick Douglass papers to, again, construct this narrative about who Elizabeth Jennings was and what she actually did to mark a milestone in racial progress, not only in New York City history, but the continuum of the Black freedom movement throughout U.S. history. So I wanted to share that with everyone today, and I really hope that this presentation sparks some questions and some curiosity about how we think of race in our historical narratives, who we consider icons and heroes in our history, and how Elizabeth Jennings' story connects to understanding many of these issues that face our nation today. Just to start off, she was born in Lower Manhattan in 1830 to Thomas L. Jennings, who was an African-American entrepreneur, a veteran of the War of 1812, and a very prominent abolitionist in the free community in New York City. It is unclear whether or not Thomas Jennings was born a freedman or a slave, but again, he was very prominent in the community. He was a boarding house owner. He was one of the first African Americans to obtain a patent for a laundry tailor device, and again was involved in local organizations concerning emancipation in the antebellum New York and Northeast areas. Her mother, Elizabeth Jennings Sr., was born in New Jersey. Again, unsure if she was born a freeman or enslaved, but she was highly involved in matters concerning Black education in New York City. Elizabeth Jennings attended the colored normal schools in New York City and became a teacher in the former African free schools in New York City, which were established by the New York Manumission Society to assist with the transition from enslavement to freed life for the children of emancipated slaves in the city after the Revolutionary War. Alexander Hamilton and John Jay were founding members of the African free schools. Eventually, by the time Elizabeth Jennings started teaching in the African free schools, which was around the early 1850s, those schools had already been co-opted into what was then the New York City Board of Education. But these were segregated schools, and she taught in several of these schools and even served as an acting principal in one of these schools. She was also an organist at her church and frequently played at assemblies concerning matters of abolition and slavery in the antebellum U.S. Now, her contributions to this milestone of racial progress in New York City that this book was referencing to took place on a Sunday morning in July of 1854, when her and a friend were on their way to church services. And they went to go catch a trolley car or a horse-drawn streetcar to attend services. And when she tried to get on a car operated by the Third Avenue Railway Company, the conductor and a nearby police officer forcibly ejected her from the streetcar. Now, in New York City, although there were no specific laws that segregated mass transit, it was customary where African Americans were to only ride on certain cars. Oftentimes, these companies, like the Third Avenue Railroad Company, which were privately run, would put signs on the cars to indicate whether or not blacks could ride or not. And this particular car didn't have a sign on it. She tried to get back on the car, and again, she was forcibly removed from the car by the conductor and a police officer. She then told her father, who then had her testimony read to their church congregation about what happened. And the congregation moved to not only have her testimony and resolutions to address this matter in the local newspapers such as the New York Daily Tribune, which was Horace Greeley's newspaper, and the Frederick Douglass papers, but also raised funds to hire the law firm of Culver, Parker, and Arthur to represent her in a lawsuit against the company. This was significant because this law firm previously adjudicated the 1852 Lemon case, which set legal precedents that slaves traveling through New York were free. Again, this was pretty big, hence challenging the reach of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. So, 24-year-old attorney Chester A. Arthur, so yes, the same man who became president in 1881, handled Jennings's case and represented her in New York Supreme Court in February 1855. And he argued that the company was in violation of common carrier laws, which stated that paying passengers have a right to ride on public conveyances. The Judge Rockwell instructed the jury to find in Jennings's favor, and she was awarded a financial settlement. Interestingly enough, she sued for $500. The jury awarded her about half that, which Horace Greeley discusses in his article. Well, actually, we believe it was Horace Greeley who wrote this article about the Jennings verdict. There's no named author, but again, historians like John H. Hewitt, who had researched matters of civil rights in New York City, states that he believes that this was written by Horace Greeley, that there were clearly some sort of discriminatory sentiments held by some members of the jury for not finding to award Jennings her full amount of her lawsuit and damages. Nevertheless, she does win. Now, although this was a major precedent set in terms of using the legal system to challenge segregation in the antebellum North, Jennings's case is not very well known, not only in just mainstream narratives, historical narratives of this time period, but even in the 1850s. Her case was pretty much a locally publicized case that did not set widespread precedents for other companies to desegregate their streetcars. Other African Americans in New York City after the 1855 ruling tried to challenge segregation on other streetcar lines that did not win in court. But nonetheless, this was a really important case that you had an African American woman using the legal system to challenge such treatment. Interestingly enough, she is often compared to Rosa Parks for her actions in 1955, so a century later, which we know led to the Montgomery bus boycott and subsequent civil rights legislations of the 60s. Even though, again, Jennings' case did not lead to widespread desegregation, her case does highlight that the North was not exclusive to these issues of race and racial discrimination before the Civil War and, of course, afterwards as well. Jennings' story continues, and even though this was in a lot of ways the apex of her activism, she still continued to be a pioneer of African American civil rights after her court case. She later is a gentleman named Charles Graham, and together they married and they had a son, and the baby died in infancy right after the 1863 draft riots subsided in Manhattan. She and her husband, along with the help of a pastor, were able to escape the violence going on in Lower Manhattan to bury their son out in Cypress Hill Cemetery, which is present day in Queens. She continued to teach in the former African free schools that were a part of the New York City Board of Education until her death in 1901, which I find to be so interesting because in many cases, married women were not allowed to keep their teaching jobs. But Elizabeth Jennings did. And she did not only as a married woman, but again, a woman who had a child, which seems to indicate that she was also very involved in feminist causes within the African American community. She was active in her church with regard to, later on after the Civil War, matters of civil rights and also matters concerning plight and poverty in Africa. And she was a part of a committee that helped found the first African American kindergarten in New York City in her home, which was located in the downstairs of her home in Manhattan in 1895. H. Cordelia Ray writes about this school in an article where she notes how the, quote, Jennings Library was a place of curiosity for the young children who attended the school. Elizabeth Jennings died in 1901 due to kidney disease. She, her husband, her son, her parents, and extended family are all buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Queens, New York. My research about Elizabeth Jennings has addressed not only her case, but looking at larger issues of why she's been a relatively obscure historical figure in New York and U.S. history narratives. Some reasons include that there are just a lack of primary sources by or about Elizabeth Jennings. This was a very difficult task. I attempted to write my master's thesis about Elizabeth Jennings, but at the time I could not obtain enough documents to construct a full-fledged narrative. Even to research the angle of Chester Arthur, his papers prior to his presidency are really tough to find. I have not given up on it, but that was a huge challenge, where most of the documents that are available about Elizabeth Jennings and her court case are provided by Frederick Douglass in his papers, and using the Chronicling America series on the Library of Congress website to find the newspaper articles that documented her case. Also, fires were typical in Antebellum, New York, which could mean that whatever documents were available in terms of records, census information, maybe books and letters that Elizabeth Jennings had wrote were destroyed. We don't know. But that also a larger matter of issues of race and inclusion of African American history in mainstream historical narratives in the school curriculum continues to be an issue with regard to whose history counts in the official lexicon of our studies. And I published several articles that highlight her biography and the matter of inclusion in the social studies and history curriculum. We've also done some research on how using the available primary sources about Elizabeth Jennings and her court case can be used for instruction in history and social studies classes with regard to promoting tenets of historical empathy. So meaning, how can we teach students historical thinking and thinking skills by identifying the historical context of documents, identifying different perspectives provided by authors of these documents, but then in terms of historical empathy, how can students make effective connections to document evidence and history content to their lives, to current events happening in today's world. Also instructing on how to discern context and avoiding presentism when making these effective connections. But there's a lot of promise and possibility, not only for the historical scholarship on Elizabeth Jennings, but also how these documents and how her example can be used and included in much of our history instruction. I've also worked on some research on how and why she's been compared to Rosa Parks, and I find that there are a lot of parallels, which hopefully myself and other scholars can continue researching with regard to how Elizabeth Jennings pretty much came from an upper class African American family in the Antebellum era. Rosa Parks came from much more humble means, and how their socioeconomic backgrounds really impacted how not only they were involved in activist causes, but particularly their circumstances that allowed them to participate in their activism, and how their lives played out after their activist causes were enacted. Elizabeth Jennings continued to teach. She, from what I can understand, maintained a relatively comfortable financial situation until her death, where Rosa Parks and her husband Raymond really struggled after her arrest in 1955, where eventually they had to move to Virginia and then settled in Detroit, where she worked for 20 years as John Conyers' congressional secretary. So that's been an angle of research that I've also have been examining with regard to whether or not is Elizabeth Jennings a Rosa Parks figure, or is Rosa Parks an Elizabeth Jennings figure. So I always found that to be pretty compelling about these two very brave women. But I also basically hope I'm trying to continue on with these studies, and I try to be very mindful of how the inclusion of underrepresented figures in our history impacts my mindfulness of when I am engaged in instruction here at SNHU, and how I interact with my students. How this history contributes to the beautiful mosaic of the diversity of America, and how the bravery and the actions of our ancestors still have a lasting impact on our world today. So I hope this was an enjoyable presentation. Again, if you have any questions about Elizabeth Jennings, please feel free to reach out, and I hope that her story further inspires our practice in pedagogy and scholarship in our history courses here at SNHU. Thank you.